whatever time it's supposed to be, the 30-minute, I'm in the wrong time zone. 2:30, right? 2:30. Welcome to the horror panel. My name is Mark Leslie Lefebvre, but I do write my horror and true ghost stories under Mark Leslie. And I have with me Jonathan Maberry as well. And we do plan on opening this up to questions relatively early, but we're going to start by pitching some questions back and forth. I'm going to start with a low ball, an easy slow ball. I'm just going to throw across the plate here. Jonathan, how many Hawaiian shirts do you have?
319. Yes, and my wife thinks I need an intervention.
I think you need more, because you got to round up.
I intend to buy more. That's not what I have at the moment.
Do people buy Hawaiian shirts for you? Because people buy skulls and give them to me. Because not real humans, but
they do. They never get my size right. I have the size of basically, Bigfoot's chubby brother.
Awesome. That is
Which is scary in its own way.
So I think one of the questions we were talking about earlier on was foundational horror. So everyone in the room here is either obviously interested in writing horror, wanting to know more about it, but that probably meant somewhere along the lines you encountered horror, you encountered a story that captivated you and pulled you in. What was that for you?
For me, it was when I was 12 years old. Ray Bradbury gave me a copy of The Haunting of Hill House and said, "You need to read it, and the next time I see you, you need to explain it to me." And I read the book, and it completely blew me away. I read it every Halloween, by the way, and I have since I was a kid. And every Halloween, every time I read it, I switch my opinion as to whether it is a ghost story or a story about psychological disintegration as told through an unreliable narrator. And I don't know where I land. One thing about that book, it has the best opening paragraph I have ever read in horror. And I'm actually going to read it to you right now. Pat Malzwell has it on his site.
Awesome.
No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed, by some, to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. Now that is how you write horror. That is because the opening paragraph of it, and I remember reading that as a kid for the first time. I got chills then, I got chills reading it now, and it still does that for me. Because what this type of horror did, and because it was, I had read, we all read like horror comics and things like that, but this was something I read for the writing of it. Given to me by a writer who knew that I wanted to grow up to be a writer. What it does is it doesn't tell us what it is. It suggests what it might be and invites us, as the reader, to co-create the story along with the writer, which means we become emotionally and psychologically invested in it, and therefore whatever happens matters more to us than if it was just a story where everything was told to us and we didn't have to contribute our thoughts and our emotions and our imagination to the process. That is one of the greatest pieces of writing ever. The book is a short book. It's like 65,000 words. You really absolutely should read it. What about you?
Actually, it was a short story, a very familiar author. I actually look at The Lottery as something I had to read in school. And I think the horror in that story is the kind of horror that fascinates me. And I know there's a question we're going to be talking about a little bit later related to that, but it's the monster is part of us. It's either tradition. It's the things that we just blindly follow without realizing what we're doing, who we're harming along the way. And so that horror has always fascinated me, which kind of leads to the I think we were talking earlier about the monster or the monster hunter. And you've got the two, let's go back to Frankenstein for a second. As it's not the monster hunter, but the Frankenstein, and I was going to ask you about your thoughts on the adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House, which I thought was was well done.
The first one, not the second.
So, yeah, so that's what I'm curious. Like, what did they get right? Because when you do an adaptation, you're not doing it word for word. You're not doing it scene for scene. You're getting atmosphere sometimes, or the other elements, and sometimes it's not going to match that thing that went on in your imagination, right?
Well, the adaptation of it got it right, black and white version of it. It got it right for all the reasons the Liam Neeson version got it wrong.
Okay.
It invited us to figure out whether this is a haunting or not, because at no point, well, there's actually one point that there's a reason for it, but you don't see the monsters. You don't see a ghost. It's so much driven by point of view, and as people get creeped out by the thought that the place is probably haunted, they, infuse every scene with their own fears. There's only one scene where something is happening, they all say, where we're all in a room and the wall just starts breathing in at them after something comes banging down. But by that point, they have all gotten themselves, worked up. So, shared hallucination is a real thing, and the writers suggest that they are all, because they all believe now something is coming, they see something. But is it really there? And the whole story is told from the point of view of a woman who's going through a psychological disintegration. She is telling us about that moment. Did the moment really happen? So that type of storytelling, I absolutely love. I don't read it for the ghosts, by the way. I don't read it for the monsters. I read it for the monster hunter. The person pitted against it. I liked Van Helsing more than Dracula. In Frankenstein's the monster. Adam, which is the name of the creature, is not. He's the victim of the monster. He does horrific things because he has been created in a way that fractures his ability to understand cause and effect, and has to relearn, how to be part of the human race until he realizes he's not and flees. But Victor Frankenstein is a monster by a mile.
Yeah, for sure. So that's and is that something in your own writing that you constantly return to that thing?
Yeah, I'm not one of those people that's going to write a story that praises the monster. It's like even with gangster stories. I don't like The Godfather. I don't like stories where the bad guys become the sympathetic protagonists. I'm not the audience for that. I don't say it's bad writing because that's not fair to say. I'm not the audience for it. I grew up in a really poor environment. My father was a horrible human being. He ran the local chapter of the KKK. He was a child abuser and a career criminal. So I grew up with a monster in my house. So I didn't want to read stories about monsters because I don't want to read a story where someone like my father would have even more power. I wanted to read stories where somebody goes up against a creature with such power that it doesn't appear that person has any chance of winning, so they need to level up within their own life by either association with other people, acquisition of knowledge, whatever it's going to be, so that they can defeat the impossible by making the impossible possible to be defeated. That's what appeals to me. So I'm definitely more the monster hunter guy. What about you?
I agree with you. You think about shows like Sons of Anarchy or something like that, where you have glamorized the bad guys, and I understand that. I think when it comes to the motivation of each character in the story, everyone's the hero. Nobody, like there are the stereotypical villains that actually think they're evil.
Yeah, Frankenstein thought he was a good guy.
Yeah.
Conquer that.
So I do like exploring the character, the bad guy, in a way that's sympathetic from their perspective and their point of view. And I really love the dichotomy of how that creates conflict. Now, obviously, from the reader's perspective, there's usually the perspective, but I really enjoy getting into it, getting into why that person is or that thing is a monster. It's not always supernatural, of course, right? Like even in the supernatural, you've got
your example of your favorite horror was not a supernatural story.
Yeah.
Monsters do not need to be supernatural, and horror does not require supernatural elements. Silence of the Lambs won the Bram Stoker Award as best horror novel that year. It was a horror novel. It doesn't have to be monsters. And that's one of the things people don't understand about horror, that horror is not us fighting the supernatural, it's us fighting something that threatens our life as we know it, that tries to take from us, vampire stories were originally metaphors for rape or abuse. The creature took what somebody didn't want taken, and they used force and seduction as a kind of force in order to accomplish that. It creeps me out that vampires have been romanticized since. It really creeps me out because I don't like that. It's kind of like the old soap operas, like Who Was Guiding Light, where Luke had raped Laura, and then later on, because he was a popular character, they had him fall in love and get married. Their marriage was the biggest on TV. I'm like, you friggin' raped her. At what point is he going to walk back and be okay, and she going to be okay with him? It's an unrealistic presentation. He's the monster of the story. He should not get to win, and he got to win. That's what drives me nuts.
Okay, so the winning thing is intriguing. I remember talking to Kevin Anderson early in the pandemic when we were all very scared. There was a real life thing happening around the world, and people were on ease. And I remember Kevin saying that's one of the beauties of being able to write is the good can win. Is that I can control, like I can crank up the tension, right? But we can actually we can control it, and we can't control anything else. So does this horror become even more relevant in times of unease?
Well, sure. I mean, a lot of writers, it doesn't matter indie or traditional, writers are writers. A lot of writers use autobiographical elements, whether it is something happened to them personally, their family, or culturally, as with COVID. And since life doesn't always give us a good third act, fiction allows us to explore the dynamics of that crisis and people caught up in the crisis, but give it a resolution that the real world doesn't always offer us. I was in one of the rare situations as an abused kid in that I studied martial arts on the side. By the time I was 14, I was able to physically stop my father from abusing my sisters and myself. But most people didn't get a chance to beat their own monster. And it's unfair to write stories in which either the monster wins or somebody remains disempowered. Horror allows us to take characters and give them the opportunity, the Mina Harker, John Harker, and so on, to learn enough and to become empowered by knowledge to be able to fight back against the monster and to win. So we can write that third act into it, and as both author writing it and reader reading it, we get the satisfaction of the monsters can be defeated.
I love that. You had shared something with me, and I would totally if I asked that, because it relates to your father, and it relates to work you did with Marvel and the Black Panther. Could you share a little bit about that? Because it almost felt like that allowed you to redeem.
Well, that was a big win for me. So, when I was a kid, father, racist, I grew up in a neighborhood where that was kind of the vibe. There were no people of color anywhere in my neighborhood. First person of color I met was in 7th grade, when we went to a different school. So, in the Fantastic Four comics in the 60s, they introduced the character of T'Challa the Black Panther. A guy, a black man who was not anyone's sidekick. He wasn't the comic relief. He wasn't a step and fetch sort of horrible cliche. He was the king of his own country. And in the comics, T'Challa is the genius. It's not Shuri. T'Challa is on a par with Tony Stark and Henry Pym and Reed Richards. He's one of the smartest people in the Marvel Universe. And he defines his own power. His nobility was strong. Of course, my father, seeing those comics, would rip them up. When I went to 7th grade, I showed that comic, one of the comics to the librarian in my middle school, and this is why I think librarians are superheroes. And she said, well, this particular issue is about apartheid. I'm like, what's that? And she's like, and she explained it. She said, do you know about the Jim Crow laws? Do you know about Martin Luther King? I said, yeah, my father thought he was a bad guy. They had a party when he died. And she said, oh my God, we have to have the longest talk ever. And I got, and what this does, when somebody presents information to you, and it opens your eyes, you talk about nature versus nurture. That is an imperfect equation. It's nature, nurture, and choice. By having my eyes open, I was able to make a decision as to whether I want to close my eyes and be a clone of my father, or whether I want to keep my eyes open and split off from my father and become somebody else. So rolling forward some years later, I'm writing for Marvel Comics at this point, 2008 and 9. 8, I think, was when this conversation started. And Reginald Hudlin, the founder of BET Network, and a prominent, one of the top black producers, was writing the book before me, and he heard me talk about this story, and how T'Challa, the Black Panther was my role model as a kid. That character saved my life as a kid. He gave me the faith and the optimism to come out of my own horror story. right? It's actually one of the reasons I started martial arts, because he could fight. He beat up the entire Fantastic Four. I had to be able to do this, So Reggie gave me the comic to write, so I went up writing the Black Panther comic. And because of what happened to my sisters, I spent 35 years of my life teaching women self-defense. He changed the comic so that near the end of his run, T'Challa got injured, Shuri had to step up to be the Panther, so he handed off the Black Panther comic to me with Shuri as the Panther. I got to write the feminist Black Panther comic for 2 years. And just recently, by the way, the new movie that came out uses characters I created and plot points from my run. So I actually got to go to the world premiere. I got to go to the world premiere of Black Panther Wakanda and explain this to the cast. And we were all crying. And we're also celebrating that this character, who is widely seen as the most important pop culture icon for young black kids, he's the most important pop culture icon for anyone who wants to break out of the harsh propagandized conditioning that so many kids go through when a parent is the monster in their life. So,
thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate that. We'll probably open up to questions.
There's a mic over there.
Yeah. If you don't use the mic, I will ask whatever question I want to.
Can you go to the mic though?
Have you worked with Lydia Corford with Black Panther?
Have I worked with Lydia Corford? Actually, I didn't work with her, though she used some of my stuff. She and I and John Romita Jr. did a panel together at DragonCon, the first time I met her, and we had the best time in the world. And she's brilliant, and she's powerful and fierce, and I love her pieces. We needed writers like her, and when she wrote, stories in the Black Panther world, she did, one of the things she did, and some of the other writers who have taken on did, is they switched it from being Americans writing about African characters to African people writing about African characters, which gave it a much deeper viewpoint. And the fact that I think she's Nigerian American, allows us to have both the Afrocentric viewpoint and the American viewpoint in a way that everybody reading the comic can understand. Which since our culture, by the way, we thought, I'm the end of the hippie era, we thought we were solving racism and everything else, and clearly it's back. So we're now back in a new kind of horror story for new generations that are dealing with real world horror. Sometimes pop culture is what's going to allow us to believe that those monsters can be real.
Hi, so writing horror between YA and adult, I went from NG Supernatural to YA, and I was like, ooh, that's nice, awesome, in my YA books. But when you're going YA to adult now, what are some things you will not, absolutely won't do in a YA horror that you would, and vice versa, versus an adult horror book?
Things you wouldn't do in YA.
What or wouldn't do, yeah.
What or wouldn't do. And that area has become so gray as YA, readership in YA lately has expanded. I mean, even in non-horror YA books, I'm looking at stuff, I go, I can't believe they're doing that. I don't know. I mean, because when you talk about horror, it's about pushing the boundaries, right? So I'm not sure, you would be more familiar working with, mainstream publishers. What are certain things that developmental editors like, that's not going in there?
I had a lot of these conversations when I started doing the Rock and Roll series for Simon Schuster, because it's growing up 14 years after the zombie apocalypse, zombies and so on. The zombies weren't the monsters in the story, even though they had to deal with zombies. The people who were exploiting the advantages that occur during an apocalyptic situation when the infrastructure has failed, they are the monsters. But as far as what I wouldn't put in there, very little. I mean, I'm not writing for kids who grew up in the safest environment. I write for kids like me. I don't write down to those kids at all. In fact, anyone who writes down to kids should stop writing for kids. My stuff has edges all over it. It has bear traps and thorns and everything else. I will dial down a little bit of the graphic violence. I'll dial down the language, of course, because I do want it to show up in school libraries, so the language is an issue. I won't have any graphic sex in the story, which I occasionally put in my adult fiction. But really, the only thing that changes in YA fiction for me in terms of the characters encountering horror is the kids have to solve the problem. They can't be rescued by adults. And that is probably the one thing that defines my approach to YA. The kids have to solve the problem, and not by acting like adults, but by solving the problems the way kids would solve a problem. And I remember what I was like with my friends as teenagers. We had a lot of issues in my neighborhood. We had to solve our own problems. There were no, we couldn't expect our parents to come rescue us because our parents were monsters. So we had to solve them. So in my fiction, I reflect that.
Thank you.
Good question.
With regard to the haunting of Hill House, and from the point of view that humans can be considered from their creation to after death as spirits, what do you think of the idea that the house was being haunted by the humans? From the title, The Haunting of Hill House.
Well,
No.
I just
Yeah, so he chastised me because I haven't actually read it, but guess when I'm going to read it next? Halloween.
Oh, Halloween. Well, my grandmother, who, if you can imagine Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter as an old lady, that was my grandmother, believed in everything. She believed that a lot of times a haunting was people imposing their will on a house because it was so permanent that it would anchor them to the world, and they got lost by doing so. I thought it was an interesting perspective. She also believed that a lot of ghosts were actually people coming from other dimensions, and that's a different story. But in The Haunting, very much, that's very much a plot point where the woman who is there who believes the house is haunted finds even the haunting somewhat appealing because it is a place to belong and to be powerful. And she is completely disempowered in the other parts of her life. But if she becomes the ghost of that house, she's as powerful as the house. And, missed by a lot of people who read it, but caught by the people who read it and think about it after they've stopped reading it. The haunting, if it is an actual haunting story, and I'm usually on the fence about it, then it is actually a story of that character's redemption by becoming the ghost. And it's a story of empowerment, a weird story of empowerment, but definitely a story of empowerment.
I've written stories in which the haunting is a live person that you can leave your spirit behind, not after you've died, but you've left it. Not left your heart in San Francisco, but that sort of thing.
My grandmother used to call that, she said, there are some people that are curators, that love an area so much, they do not want to leave it because they knew that to some degree they were protectors of that space.
Yes.
So they remain such. And it's a
great theory.
Yeah, it's weird. It's something I haven't seen in fiction, and I probably should get around to writing it. My grandmother has so many cool ideas. My sisters were terrified of her. I loved her.
Oh, I can imagine.
It feels like religious horror is having a bit of a moment, and religion and horror have always been bedfellows in a lot of ways with the Midnight Mass, with Midsummer, but I'm curious to your thoughts on why that is, why those two come each other so often.
Well, I'm thinking about Midnight Mass as a great example. But so what does religion bring us universally, regardless of the religion? Usually it's meant to bring you answers to the questions we don't have answers for. So it's mystical and supernatural in many of its guises. I'm always fascinated with the religion, and you see it in some classic stories where the religion can misguide someone, or the person can misinterpret the religion in a way that they become evil, or as opposed to. And so that always fascinated me, because it's like when you think you're going to find redemption, or you think you're going to find grace, you actually it's the not the false gods or something like that.
Also, to a great degree, many religions can be defined as horror in the way they're used. Even though I no longer define myself as a Christian, I actually at one point was going to go to seminary. I really was into it, and I wanted to become that radical minister who was always arrested and he didn't care. But one of the things about it, I don't know too many people who vocally call themselves Christians who actually paid attention to what Jesus was saying. The whole thing about the message is, hey, don't be an asshole, be a good guy, maybe be nice to people that you don't even know. And it seemed like as soon as he died, everyone else decided, well, let's take that and do the exact opposite in his name. Inquisition. I mean, in Jesus' name, the Inquisition, the witch trials, all these different things. There's no, it's hard to find examples where a religion is truly living up to its intended mission. And I know that's a fault of people, and people are flawed, and there's arguments to be made. I don't give a crap about that. Religion has been used as a weapon too often. It's been used and in its form, when it becomes so weaponized that it intrudes on the lives and opportunities, thoughts, of families, it's becoming the monster of the story. It's so much easier to build a case for how religion is doing harm than it is for religion doing good. I know there are people. I know a lot of people who are involved with religions who do really good in the name of their religion, and they are outnumbered 100 to 1 by people who are using religion as a baseball bat to hit people over the head. And it's a shame because if you read the texts of all these various religions, they're actually pretty cool. Good set of ethical tenets. Let's follow those. But no, let's cherry pick it and find ways to hate one another. So it's his own kind of horror story.
Thank you.
Great question.
That would be a great anthology, by the way.
Jonathan, in your cross-genre panel, you talked a little bit about the rise of horror and how horror used to be a bad word, and now it's kind of coming back in this new, amazing, full force. I published a couple of horror-adjacent books traditionally, and my own experience was, this was about 10 years ago, that horror was becoming trendy again, and editors were interested in it, but they didn't actually have, they hadn't really read horror, they didn't really understand the audience for it, or the tropes and why those tropes worked. So whether or not your experience is the same as mine, I just wanted to you to talk a bit about that evolution and what you've been seeing in the actual.
Yeah, actually, I'll give you an example of one of the most absurd conversations I ever had. So, and for those who weren't in the know, talk real quickly, because so many horror movies in the 80s and 90s were misogynistic, killing women, because women scream more than men, all that bullshit, killing teenagers because they're having sex, and then the torture porn movies of that generation. People were conflating horror as a genre with extreme transgressive, ugliness. And horror is so much more than that. And now, because of the success of horror shows and television and movies and books, everything from The Ruins to The Strain, we're getting to see the horror is much bigger, much broader than that. But one of this conversation happened. I got a phone call from my editor, McMillan, right? And he said he just walked out of a meeting with the marketing people and the publisher, and this young marketing person, and everyone in marketing and publishing is about 11, maybe 12 years old. So they don't remember anything of what was going on before. It was all before the time. And this guy legitimately said, there's this new genre that's starting to get hot, and we should probably jump on it. Horror. And my editor, who's actually he's 40-something, he's one of the oldest people at the table, is going, new? He's like, yeah, it's brand new. And they said, anybody have a writer who could write horror? And a couple looked at Michael and said, don't you have somebody who's writing previous stuff? He's like, yeah, Jonathan's won 5 Bram Stoker Awards. He's a horror writer. He's on the board of the Horror Writers Association. And they say, well, then he should probably know how to write a horror novel, right? And they wound up giving him a budget beyond what they're paying me for my Joe Ledger books to write a horror novel. The Joe Ledger novel, half the Joe Ledger novels are horror novels. The first one's about zombies, for God's sake, But they were dead serious. The new generation of publishing didn't know horror was ever a thing. They don't remember, of course they don't remember, the late 60s, early 70s when you had Ira Levin's Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, when there was mainstream novels. There wasn't even a horror section in the bookstore. And Barnes & Noble only recently added a horror section to the bookstore. Now suddenly horror is a thing. And so I'm lucky to be writing in this new genre. What's that? I took that. You kidding?
So I'm 23 and I just published my debut novel, Paranormal Horror.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I was wondering, obviously I'm probably one of the, into the new generation coming into horror. I was wondering, as experienced professionals in the field, what do you think is underutilized in horror? What pathway do you think people don't see when they're going into it and what they want to write?
Okay, well, I got two answers for that. One is culturally based horror concepts. I did a whole talk about old school monsters the other day.
Yes.
Everybody has some historical cultural background that is not just generic American. We're Italian American, African American, or Nigerian American, or whatever. Whatever our background is, that background has thousands of monsters in it.
Like
that
the
are-
Japanese,
like the Japanese, the Japanese and Koreans have been ahead of the curve in using their folkloric monsters. And there's people like, oh my God, I've never seen anything like that before. And the Japanese are like, yeah, but we've seen that for like 100 years or 500 years. I've written 5 nonfiction books on the folklore of supernatural monsters. It's what got me interested in writing fiction in the first place, because these monsters, the versions of vampires, the versions of werewolves and so on, are completely unlike the Hollywood versions. And conversely, the Hollywood versions, which are also the fiction version, we call them the Hollywood versions of vampires and so on, have no corollary in folklore. There's nowhere in folklore that a vampire is killed by a stake through the heart, is afraid of sunlight, casts no reflection. All that was made up by horror writers. The whole thing about vampires not being able to enter a house unless they're invited was invented by Bram Stoker, because otherwise Dracula would get to even kill everyone. So if you're going to write new stuff, draw on either your cultural folklore or instead of trying to write something that is like on trend with what people find scary, truly write what you find frightening. Because what you find frightening isn't what I find frightening.
I write a lot of mental health horror, so like my first book is depression-based, that sort of thing, kind of playing on the mind.
And right now you're in Shirley Jackson's zone. So you're in the best possible zone right there. And that type of psychological horror, emotional horror, there is such a huge audience who is waiting for someone to give them a book that shows that not only does somebody else get it, and that they're still dealing with it, but so it isn't like just because they have these issues that they're going to solve it. They're dealing with it, and that when things get scary, there are things they can do about it. We can do that for readers. I wrote about child abuse in my first 3 horror novels. I've had so many conversations with people who have been waiting for someone to be able to speak frankly on that subject in that genre. So if this is your experience, take that, and by writing it, you develop agency over it. You get to give it the ending you want. Even if it's not the ending of your life, the ending you want. You become that powerful.
Thank you, sir.
Great question.
You had mentioned earlier just now that you've taken events from earlier in your life and that influenced your writing. For horror, there is that supernatural element. So have you ever taken events from your own life or people you know that maybe it's just a weird event or could be questionably supernatural and incorporate that into your work? And if you did, how do you do it without being cringy or making the people you know who experienced that upset with you?
I do a lot of research because I write true tales told as true ghost story books and rife with examples like that. And there's so many stories I hear from people that I can't ever use in a book because it's not going to fill a chapter, but it's an interesting anecdote. I think, all the time, taking these things. But the thing that I find most fascinating, it goes back to that original you never see. You never see the monster, you never see the ghost, you never actually know if the house is haunted, but there's things you can't explain. And it's often that questioning of what did cause this that I find the most compelling answers in. And you can take that same question in a single instance and come up with 10 different stories. And that, I'm guilty of plagiarizing from a single idea, my own thing, and I go, well, there's one thing here, I'm gonna write that. And then this other story, I'm going to use the same thing, the same source, but you don't know because the answer was different. I find huge value in that because so if you ask the question today, you might have answer A. If you ask the question again next year, you're going to get a different answer. And I think, I mean, you're never going to run out just from, a handful of those questions that you can keep answering.
Yeah, for me, I mean, it's funny, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. I believe that there is a larger world that I simply cannot define yet. But I have not yet seen it, and I'm so open to it. I'm like Mulder, I want to believe. I want to go to a haunted house that I can tell is legit haunted. I want to feel that. And for whatever reason, I haven't had that experience, but I know plenty of folks who have, whose credibility I do not call into question. People who have seen bizarre things, and those are the people I grilled for information because I want to know what it felt like to be in the moment when they go from doubt to belief, because there's the story. When somebody actually believes that. And there are people who have experienced things and who have told me with such clarity without going down a rabbit hole of extrapolating on it, just tell me what their experience was that could not be explained could not obviously be explained by normal things. I want them to tell me that story, and I've had people tell me that in ways that I have believed that was their experience. So I'm very open-minded, I'm very enthusiastic about the encounter. If I don't encounter it, I'll still keep my open mind because I have no proof that it doesn't exist. And that's a really key thing. Just because I don't know it to be true, I cannot and will not be arrogant enough to say it's impossible.
If you ever need to talk to people in Louisiana,
I lived in New Iberia for a year, and I love the ghost stories and the magic stories, all the charms against the Greek charms against evil. Love it all. So yeah, you're right.
Have to be the villain on this one.
Right.
So we've talked about a lot of different groups and generalized. When you're dealing with horror, there's two questions. What is the purpose of horror? Is the purpose of horror or writing in general, is the purpose to entertain, or is the purpose to push a narrative? Yes. And the second part about it is, because we were talking about religion and some of the axioms of religion and some of the axioms of the Western culture and other cultures, how do you know when you're writing some of these things, whether or not you may be veering into, as a writer, because there's a lot of people who take some messages that you're saying, and they'll, like you said, some people take religious texts and do it wrong. Mm-hmm. What is to keep some people going, oh, I just need to do this, but they're actually, I don't know if you've seen the movie Get Out, they're actually being the characters in Get Out, and we're like, oh, we think we're doing, but we're actually just using you to get more for us. Where is that line at, exactly?
So are you talking cultural appropriation?
Well, we can go through cultural appropriation, we can go through generalizing religious people as being
fully created cliche or assumption. Actually, this is something that really matters to me, especially in the way I teach writing, but also the way I write my own stuff. I don't want any of my characters or situations to be my assumption only. I'm a middle-aged white guy. I do not have experiences beyond being a middle-aged white guy.
You look like a 20
So when I'm doing research, I don't just, like when I was doing research I did a novel called Ink, and just to use one example, two characters. There was a relationship there between a lesbian woman and a bi-curious woman. I am not a lesbian woman, I am not a bi-curious woman. So I interviewed scores of people whose experience was that. And not just asking them questions, but actually frickin' listening to their answers. And then asking follow-up questions to go deeper, because when I write characters of any experience other than my own, if it is filtered through my assumption, it's never going to feel real. But if I listen to what they say, and I dig deep into it with optimism, open mind, respect, and curiosity, what I can do is I can get enough of a sense of it to craft that into my story, and then I'm going to ask someone to vet it, to make sure that I didn't, even in the writing of it, trip into a cliche. Because I hate cliche writing, I hate cliche assumption. When I took over Black Panther, I followed two black writers, and I'm a white writer on Black Panther. That creates its own series of issues. So I talked to, I didn't want to write, I was very political in my issue, my comments. So I actually got in touch with journalists in several West African countries and interviewed them by phone and email on how they report the news within their countries, both domestically and the way in which that news would be treated for the world. Their version of it is what I put in my story, not my own.
Yeah, well, that kind of goes to my question though, because if you're talking to this one particular group of people from this one particular group, but everybody in that group does not believe what those particular people are.
That's why I interview scores of people rather than
scores of people. But there's a lot there's certain things that I have heard from people talk about, like especially as African American, we get boxed into. There are 10 things that we're allowed to like my voice right now. If you're not like playing at the camera, they think I'm something else because of my accent. So there is many times where there are assumptions, and this is where I'm getting at to what you're talking about, that other people think that they're writing for other people, but they're leaving out hard slots. It's the same thing with the LGBTQ community.
Right.
Everybody in that community does not believe in the same thing. Every woman does not agree on the same thing. Every man does not. Every white guy doesn't agree on the same thing. So that's kind of, so I guess your answer, I guess, if I'm getting it right, is that you get a wider breadth of people.
And it's something you plan your research in advance so that you can, as you do the interviews and you discover the differences of opinion, even on a single point, you then start exploring them and say, okay, which bias, which viewpoint fits the character I need for my story? Because I'm also not writing a guidebook to world culture. I want the character, that version of that character, that history to be fairly represented. And one of the points is, I know so many writers so many people seem to think that Africa is a country. So
they think China's a God, I missed that one up. They think that China is ethnicity.
Yeah,
China's
right.
not ethnicity.
And that's a failing in writing in research because it robs us of the chance of seeing the richness, because diversity should be celebrated and not feared. But diversity itself is an ongoing process. Just because we learn one experience that's different doesn't mean we can stop doing our homework. So often my investigation into whether it's sexual orientation, different cultures within our own culture, I want to keep learning that for a couple of reasons. Partly because it makes life more interesting, and partly selfishly because that's going to open up new ideas for characters and storylines that I would never have thought of had I not done the extra research. And that makes my writing process richer, and hopefully the experience of reading my work richer, because I would be terrified of having something go out there that could be labeled as cliche or just basically overtly assumptive.
Well, thank you for clarifying.
Great question.
We're just down to 2 minutes. So.
Easy question. What are you excited about in the horror genre? Both of you.
I'm just excited about the possibilities and that horror scene, their resurgence, and now there's more choices and options. That thrills me endlessly.
And I love the fact that horror can be added as an element to so many different things. Like the book deal I just signed on Friday is for 3 deep space science fiction novels that are Lovecraftian. So they're going to be written as horror novels, even though they're science fiction. That's why I love things like Alien and Event Horizon. Probably 10 years ago, that would have been a harder sell. But now, by putting the word horror in the mix, publishers start going, cool, and readers love it. Readers don't want hardly drawn genre lines. They want the story to go where the story needs to go to be the best story it can be. That makes me excited because if more writers on both sides of the publishing line, traditional and non-traditional, realize that they are free to write the story that that tells their story, that their understanding of this adventure, their understanding of horror, the freedom that we writers now have to be able to tell the story we want to tell is going to keep novels from being as cookie cutter we don't want the novel easily defined by a genre. We want the novel to shine because of its content. And that is what makes me excited about the new trends in horror, because we've suddenly become freer as writers because of horror, and that's a statement that would not have made sense to anyone 10 years ago.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, that was fantastic. We do have a couple questions about the market and the marketing, short stories. We'll get into that post the broadcast here, so we'll chat with you about that, and if anyone wants to listen to Jonathan, thank you so much.